This is Dr. Craig Steele, and we're continuing our series on organizational change. The first video talked about the concept of organizational culture, climate, and values. For this part of the video, we're going to focus primarily on the concept of organizational change in general, what it means from a leadership perspective, and then talk about some of the common resistance to change that you're likely to encounter within different organizations. So when we talk about organizational change, what we're talking about is a change. Is that you're going to modify or alter some element, some aspect of the organization itself, ideally to become more productive, where you want to be more effective, more efficient in terms of product and service delivery. So for example, if we take higher education and the advent of things like online education. So one of the issues with online education is that's a change. It's a different venue from what the traditional classroom model has been, where you're face-to-face with an instructor in a class. Instead, you're online, maybe watching videos, reading articles, taking assessments, and so that face-to-face interaction is different. That's a change. Neither better nor worse. It depends on how it's used and how it's viewed and what impact it has within the overall organizational dynamics. And so we talk about organizational change, we're talking about making some kind of systematic modification of how the organization operates. In regards to organizational change, part of the issue is leadership. And that is, how and to what capacity do leaders have to implement potential changes within their organizations? Some companies are what we call frustrated. That is, they want to make a change, they recognize that change is potentially necessary, but they just don't know how. They're incapable of bridging that gap and making the needed changes in order to move the organization in a direction that they want to go. Other companies are what we would consider impotent, meaning that they don't recognize they need to make a change, nor do they have the capacity to do so, even if they did. And so these companies don't recognize that change needs to happen and are incapable of implementing any kind of changes. Then there's the adaptive companies. And these are companies that both recognize opportunities to change and also have the competency or capacity to do so. Versus arrogant companies, our fourth category. And the arrogant companies are ones that recognize that there may need to be a change and we're capable of it, but we're not going to do it. And so these four categories of leadership within organization, companies that are frustrated, where they're interested in potential changes but they don't know how, impotent companies, where they don't recognize that change is necessary, nor do they know how to implement them, arrogant companies, which are ones that have capacity to make changes but choose not to, versus adaptive companies, which these are organizations that are both willing and able to make potential changes. Why is this potentially important? Well, there's a lot of pressure for organizations to have to change as part of an organizational life cycle. And so we see these pressures emerging, especially over the last 20, 30 years. Issues of, say, diversity, where now organizations have a much broader sense of individuals coming into the organization from all walks of life, religious backgrounds, ethnic, cultural differences, some from different countries and languages and belief systems, and organizations are having to figure out, how do we manage this group that's very different than it was 20 or 30 years ago inside, but also how are we going to manage this group that's outside, meaning potential customers and suppliers and other businesses that we're going to have to interact with. And so diversity itself creates a huge pressure for organizations to potentially need to change. There's technological innovations. We've seen this particularly the last 20, 30 years again, where now all of a sudden we have things like my ability to record a lecture and have it available to a class, or have it available to thousands of people all over the world potentially. Technology itself forces companies to have to readjust how they deliver products and services, how they even create those products and services. We also have an issue of economic shocks. We're coming out of a Great Recession. This is indicative of the impact that recessionary factors have, as well as when we have boom economies on potential organizations to take advantage of. And so these economic shocks have the potential to really undermine those organizations who are unable to adapt and change to an ongoing complex environment. You have competitors, competition that is now global, competition that's from places around the world that you may not even know exist. And so other people are sourcing products and services and processes all over the world. And so organizations have to be mindful of who are our competitors? What are they doing? Who are their potential customers? How are they doing things? And do we need to make a change in how we do things? Seeing ongoing social trends that impact in terms of products and service delivery as well. The issue with social media, Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn. All of those are technological changes, but they're also social trends in terms of this is how people stay connected. This is how people get jobs. These are new ways in which they're doing networking. And so all of a sudden you have this companion of social trends technology that, again, organizations have to be mindful of in terms of how do they then go about things like finding and recruiting new employees, managing employees at work and what they're doing, figuring out new markets and new possibilities and new process and new procedures. Finally, there's some pressures related to world politics. As a global economy, all of a sudden we're on a global stage. And so things that happen in Greece or Italy have an impact potentially on people in the United States. Things that happen in Mexico or in China now have a potential impact. Things that happen in Korea or in Bangladesh now have an impact on us. And so world politics themselves have an influence in terms of companies. So all of this leads to potential change. Organizational change are simply modifying different elements of the organization to better respond to the environment. We're seeing that the environment itself is much more chaotic and complex. And then we're understanding that different organizations in terms of leadership have different capacity to be willing and able to handle this new complex environment. All of which leads us to then coming up with where are the potential sources of resistance to change that organizations need to be aware of. So when we're talking about the concept of organizational change, one of the things that immediately comes up is resistance to change. That is, why should I have to change at all? Where are the different sources of resistance likely to come from? Are those resistances so strong that I can't overcome them? When we talk about resistance to change, we're really getting to the issue of perceived risk versus dissatisfaction. That is, people aren't willing to change if they're not dissatisfied. If you're happy in a relationship, happy in your job, happy in your housing, then you're much less likely to want to make some kind of change. In the same regards, there's an issue of risk. What's the risk factor? If I leave this relationship, if I leave this job, if I move from this home, is it going to increase my vulnerability? And so risk and dissatisfaction are these two counterbalancing elements in terms of pressure to change. In order to have change, what you want to do is bring up potential dissatisfaction. People who are unhappy are more likely to make a change. In the same regards, you have to bring down risk. If people feel that a change is highly risk-oriented, then they're much less likely to embark on it. So this idea of basically increasing dissatisfaction and reducing risk provides opportunities for overcoming potential resistance to change. Now, resistance to change comes in several forms. It can be individual and it can be organizational. From an individual standpoint, perceptions themselves can lead to resistance. We see the world through our own eyes, through our own experiences, and because of that, we have fairly selective information processing. So when we see an event, say the sequester going on in government right now, and how we look at sequester is going to be a big issue of who we are in our own experiences and our own attitudes. If you're a Republican, then you're likely to want to maintain low taxes and high defense spending. If you're a Democrat, then you're likely to maintain higher taxes and high increases in potential discretionary spending. And so these differences in approaches are based primarily on our different perceptions of the same kinds of events. In addition, personality factors into it. We talked before about different kinds of personality factors. In particular, things like openness and agreeableness are going to be major components at potential resistance. People who are not open to new experiences and people who are very low on the agreeableness scale are likely not to want to embrace any kind of changes. So personality itself is going to be a hindrance or a resistance to any kind of change. Habit. We have habits for most of our activities that we go through during the day. From waking up in the morning, do you have coffee? What do you have for breakfast? When do you have coffee versus when do you have breakfast? How do you get to work? What's your process for your morning routine? All of that becomes a habit. And our habits become ingrained and we don't like to change them. And so much as our morning routines become habit, so does everything else. And so when there has to be a shift in, say, work duties, work assignments, start times, end times, responsibilities, process, procedures, that goes against our habits. And that creates potential individual resistance. There are economic factors. If I make a change, am I going to be better off or worse off financially? What happens if my benefits package change? What happens if my compensation package change? What happens if I switch jobs? What happens if I switch partners? And so now there are some economic factors that are going to be counted in. There's some social needs as well. One of the issues with organizations in particular is people who get along well with the people they work with are likely to stay and be more satisfied. But if there's going to be a shift, and some people are going to be in different departments or having different responsibilities, just as a shift in a relationship causes changes in social, so do shifts in terms of people and their responsibilities at work. And so there's a social resistance to any kind of change. Am I not going to have the same kind of access to the people that I'm used to being with? There's threats to power and influence. The change in an organization, if we're going to go ahead and empower some of our frontline employees, but if you're the supervisor and you're used to managing and you're used to having authority over others, then you're probably going to be resistant to that kind of shift. So anything that's perceived as a threat to power and influence is also going to spark resistance. Knowledge and skill obsolescence. So when we see new technology upgrades, a new version of Windows, a new version of Word, and all of a sudden we have to learn something new, even though we were really good on the old one. And so we don't want to give up the fact that we were the expert on the old one. Now we have to learn something new, and that becomes a threat to our current skill knowledge. And also general fear. People are hesitant to embark on new adventures if they don't know what to expect. What happens if I leave this relationship and go to another? What happens if I leave this job and go to another? What happens if I leave this house and go to another? The unknown itself creates a lot of fear in individuals, and that by itself becomes a source of potential resistance. In addition to individual resistance to change, we also have organizational resistance to change as well, where the organization itself creates potential barriers to implementing any kind of change going forward. There's organizational structure itself. That is, the departments, policies, procedures that the organization uses, the hierarchy, authority, all of these are potential barriers to any kind of organizational change. There's an issue of focus. Organizations often will attempt to change in a very limited, narrow way without realizing the repercussions in other areas where a broader approach is necessary. There's the culture itself. We talked before about organizational culture as sort of the personality of the organization. That personality, much as individual personality characteristics like openness and agreeableness, can be resistive to potential changes in the organization. In addition, there's resource limitations themselves. How much time and treasure does the organization have to apply to any particular idea or change? That by itself creates an additional constraint. Much as we also saw in individual, issues of power and expertise also are up for potential resistance because entire divisions, departments, teams, and groups have a vested interest in maintaining their power relationships and their expertise to the organization, additional sources from an organizational level to any change initiative. The last two function in terms of the agreements the organization has. There's fixed investments. You bought the software, you upgraded the servers, you've gone ahead and done your website, and so now you paid for all of these products and services already, so you're sort of stuck with them even if you would like to make a change. In addition, there are the agreements that organizations have with other organizations, unions, labor contracts, independent contractors, suppliers, all of which also limit any kind of potential change that an organization may embark on. So all of these organizational and individual are sources of potential resistance even for great ideas that organizations may have, that they have to take into account before they can move forward with any kind of change.